The moment every diplomatic facilitator dreads is not the one they train for. They train for the aggressive delegate, the walked-out delegation, the procedural challenge filed at the wrong moment to detonate the wrong session. They train for the bilateral grievance that surfaces in a multilateral room, for the press leak time to maximum embarrassment, for the technical failure that makes 3 heads of agency look at each other across a dead screen while 40 people wait. They do not train for the moment when the most dangerous person in the room turns out to be the one everyone agreed to ignore. What happens when a lifetime of diplomatic instinct tells you to remove the disruptor? And removing him means the end of everything the summit was supposed to prevent. What kind of threat arrives not with hostility, but with a USB drive in hands that will not stop moving? And what does it mean when the person who saves the room does it not by invoking authority, but by picking up a chair and carrying it to the wrong side of the table? This is the story of 6 hours inside the Royal Institution that the official press release would later describe as a productive and historic session on the international governance of orbital debris. It is the most inadequate sentence written in English in the calendar year. The people in that room know what it actually was. Most of them will not say. Dr. Amara Osai, Senior Policy Advisor to the UK Space Agency, has said nothing publicly for 8 months. What follows is the accounting she has given privately, and it begins, as these things always do, before sunrise. She arrived at the Royal Institution at 4:47 in the morning. This was not unusual. 14 years of international framework negotiations had calibrated Amara Osai's body clock to something that was not quite human and not quite institutional. A state of permanent pre-dawn readiness that her sister called a disorder and her colleagues called professionalism. She called it the only way to make sure nothing surprised her. The Royal Institution on Albemarle Street was a deliberate choice of venue, and the choice had been hers. Not the sterile anonymity of a conference center, not the loaded symbolism of a government building. Here, in the same theater where Faraday had demonstrated electromagnetic induction, where the Christmas lectures had been filmed for 70 consecutive years, where science had always been presented as a thing belonging to everyone, the argument was built into the walls. Space is not a national resource. It is a shared one. You felt it the moment you walked in. She walked through the lecture theater at 5:50 and did what she always did. She stood at the front and looked at the empty seats and tried to feel what the room would feel like full. Today it felt different. She had run the guest list the night before the way she ran all guest lists, not alphabetically, not by delegation seniority, but by the specific and unglamorous metric of who, in this room, had the most to lose from an agreement. The Americans, led by Deputy Administrator Craig Hendricks, wanted a framework that preserved their constellation expansion timelines. The Chinese delegation, 4 people who had traveled 18 hours and would not be rushed into anything, wanted equal governance weight to match their growing orbital presence. The European bloc wanted binding enforcement mechanisms that the Americans would never sign. The private aerospace representatives, 3 CEOs whose combined satellite count exceeded several national programs, wanted seats at the table without the accountability that came with them. And then there was Viktor Sorokin, 71 years old, former chief engineer of the Soviet Space Debris Monitoring Program, which had been decommissioned in 1994, and whose institutional knowledge had been distributed across 3 successor agencies, none of which communicated with each other. Currently holding an advisory position with Roscosmos that was, by every assessment Osai had read, largely ceremonial. He had been included in the Russian delegation at the insistence of the Russian Foreign Ministry over the objection of their own space agency, for reasons no one had explained and Osai had not been able to determine. He had declined the pre-summit briefing materials. He had declined the bilateral introductory calls. He had, this morning, declined the breakfast. He was already in his seat when Osai arrived at 6:30 to begin the room check. She stopped when she saw him. He was sitting in the third row from the front, not at the delegation tables, just sitting in one of the old wooden theater seats as if he had come to watch a lecture. He had a paper notebook open on his knee, not a tablet, and he was writing in it with a mechanical pencil. He did not look up when she entered. She noted this and kept moving. By 8:45, the room had filled with the specific energy of 23 delegations performing diplomatic neutrality at each other. Os had positioned herself at the facilitator's station to the left of the main table, from which she could see every face, every hand, every exchange of glances between delegates who were not supposed to know each other as well as they did. Her earpiece connected her to the communications room 2 floors up, where her deputy, James Ockhaffer, was managing the secure feeds, the interpretation team, and the increasingly anxious palace liaison, who had been asking about the parking situation for 40 minutes. The palace liaison's name was Edward Finch, and he was 26 years old and very good at his job, which today did not involve parking, and which he did not fully understand yet. "He's 3 minutes out," Finch said in her ear. Osai straightened a stack of papers that did not need straightening. Prince William entered the Royal Institution at 8:58, without the fanfare that the room had been bracing for. This was, Osai would later reflect, the first thing he did that she had not anticipated. He came through the side entrance with 2 protection officers and 1 private secretary, and he walked directly to the main table rather than pausing at the entrance for the room to register his arrival. He shook hands with Hendricks first, the correct diplomatic choice. The Americans needed it, then moved along the table with a speed that was not rushing but was also not performing. By the time the room had properly settled into the awareness that he was there, he was already sitting down. He looked, Osai thought, like someone who had actually read the briefing materials. "Good morning," he said, and his voice carried in the old theater without effort. "I want to start by saying something that isn't in the official opening remarks, which I'm going to skip, because I think we all read the same things last night, and we don't need to hear them again." Hendricks, to Osai's left, blinked. "We have approximately 27,000 pieces of trackable debris in low Earth orbit," William continued, "and somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million pieces too small to track, but large enough to destroy a functioning satellite. I have 2 children who will be alive in 2080. I would like them to be able to use GPS." He paused. "That's why I'm here. I imagine you all have your own versions of that reason. I'd like us to spend today finding where those reasons overlap." The room was quiet for a moment in a way that was different from diplomatic quiet. It was the quiet of people recalibrating. Osai looked down at her notes so that no one would see her face, because her face was doing something unprofessional. The first session proceeded better than she had projected. Hendricks presented the American framework proposal with less defensiveness than she had expected. The Chinese delegation asked 3 questions that were pointed but not obstructive. The European bloc's lead, Dr. Ingrid Carlson, made her enforcement argument with the calm precision of someone who had made it 30 times and had finally found the right room. 2 of the 3 private CEOs were engaged in taking notes. Osai allowed herself, at approximately 10:20, a single careful breath. Victor Sorokin had not spoken. He sat at the far end of the Russian delegation's table position and wrote in his notebook and did not look up at the presentations. His delegation leader, a smooth and careful man named Petrov, had delivered Russia's opening position statement at 9:40 with practiced diplomatic fluency. Sorokin had not been part of it. At 10:34, Dr. Carlson's deputy began a slide presentation on proposed debris mitigation timelines. On the 3rd slide, Sorokin looked up. He did not raise his hand. He said in accented but precise English, "That figure is wrong." The presentation stopped. Petrov looked at Sorokin with the expression of a man watching a controlled demolition he had hoped would not happen today. the current debris density in the 550 to 650 kilometer band. Sorokin said, is not as described on that slide. The figure cited is from Western monitoring data. It does not account for fragmentation events in the past 14 months that were not fully reported in public databases. Carlson's deputy looked at his slide, then at Sorokin, with the expression of someone whose data had never been challenged by a 71-year-old Russian with a mechanical pencil. Our data is sourced from ESA and NASA Joint Monitoring, the deputy said. Yes, Sorokin said, I know. And then he went back to writing in his notebook. Osai had been watching his hands throughout this exchange. She had developed, over 14 years, a precise and unsentimental taxonomy of disruptive behavior in diplomatic settings. She knew the hands of someone performing grievance. She knew the hands of someone running a tactic. She knew the hands of someone whose governor had told them to break something specific at a specific time. Sorokin's hands were not any of those things. They were the hands of someone who was afraid, and who had been afraid for long enough that the fear had settled into something that looked, from the outside, almost like calm. She filed this. She kept watching. The second session began at 11:15 after a break that Osai had used to run 3 separate bilateral temperature checks and drink a coffee that she did not taste. Hendricks had found her in the corridor and said, quietly, your Russian problem is going to become my Russian problem if it isn't managed. I'm aware, she said. The Sorokin addition to that delegation was flagged in our pre-summit intelligence. I read the flag, she said. It assessed him as a low-level procedural irritant. Hendricks looked at her. Is that still your assessment? She thought about the hands. I'm updating it, she said. The second session was 40 minutes in when Viktor Sorokin stood up. He did not ask for the floor. He stood, and the room registered it the way rooms register sudden stillness, a ripple of attention moving from the nearest delegates outward. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a USB drive, which he placed on the table in front of him with the precise deliberateness of someone placing the last piece of evidence in a case they had been building for a long time. The Kessler cascade, he said, is not theoretical. The room did not freeze from fear. It froze from something harder to manage than fear, collective, institutional disbelief wearing the face of patience. In Sector 7 of the low Earth orbital band, between 560 and 610 kilometers, a fragmentation chain began approximately 11 hours ago. His voice had not changed register. It was the same voice he had used to correct the slide figure. It involves the debris field from the 2019 ASAT test, the 2021 Russian anti-satellite demonstration, and a constellation decommissioning event that was reported as controlled but was not. The chain has been progressing at a rate that will make that orbital band commercially and scientifically non-viable within. He looked at his notebook. 5 to 7 hours from now. Silence. Then Hendricks said, that is an extraordinary claim. Yes, Sorokin said. Made without pre-notification to any delegation, without coordination with the summit's technical committee, and sourced from. Hendricks looked at the USB drive as if it might be hazardous. That. The data is from the Bureau monitoring array, Sorokin said. It was decommissioned in 1994. It was not fully decommissioned. 3 listening stations continued passive collection under a research classification that was not shared with successor agencies or with Western monitoring partners. The data exists. It has been analyzed. It is on the drive. Petrov, the Russian delegation lead, was the color of old paper. He had clearly not known this was coming, which meant the foreign ministry had not told him, which meant someone had decided that Viktor Sorokin needed to be in this room and had not told his own delegation why. Osai's communications earpiece filled with the voice of James Acaffer from the second floor. Amara, I need you to tell me what's happening down there because the feeds are. The ESA technical lead just walked out to make a phone call, and he looks like he's going to be sick." She pressed the mute button. The room had found its voice. 3 senior delegates were speaking simultaneously. The American deputy was on his phone. One of the private CEOs, the youngest one whose company had 47 satellites in the exact orbital band Sorokin had named, had gone the particular shade of stillness that Osai associated with people doing very rapid financial calculations. Hendricks said formally to William, "Your Royal Highness, I move that this delegation's remarks be suspended and that this individual be." "I heard him," William said. It was the first time he had spoken in 11 minutes. The room heard the difference immediately. "Your Royal Highness," the appropriate response to an unverified claim of this. "I heard him," William said again in the same tone, which was not loud and was not sharp, but which had the particular quality of a door closing. He was looking at Sorokin. "Mr. Sorokin, how long have you had this data?" Sorokin looked at William for a moment before answering. "I have been monitoring the progression for 6 weeks. I reported it through internal channels 3 weeks ago. I was told the analysis was inconclusive. I was told to prepare a formal submission for review." He paused. The review timeline was 4 months. The youngest CEO made a sound that was not quite a word. Osai was already out of her seat. She took the USB drive to the technical room on the second floor against 3 protocols, 2 objections from the palace liaison, and 1 direct instruction from Hendricks's deputy to wait for verification authorization. She did not wait. James Acaffer had the ESA technical lead on a call within 4 minutes. The data began loading. Osai stood behind the technical team and watched the screens and understood, with the specific and terrible clarity of someone who had spent 14 years learning exactly enough to know when she was looking at a catastrophe, that Victor Sorokin was not running a tactic. The cascade was real. It was not yet irreversible. The modeling showed a window narrowing but present. 6 hours, possibly 7 if the fragmentation rate held at current progression. After that, the debris density in that orbital band would reach a self-sustaining chain reaction threshold. Satellites would begin failing. The band would become impassable. GPS, weather monitoring, communication infrastructure for roughly 40% of the world's internet connectivity. Not destroyed, but degraded, intermittently, unpredictably, for a decade or more while the debris field slowly decayed into lower orbits. "How confident are we?" she asked the ESA technical lead. A pause on the call. "The Burevestnik array data fills a monitoring gap we've had since 1994 and didn't know we had. If this data is accurate." "Is it?" Another pause. "Yes, I think yes." She looked at Acaffer. He was already pulling up the emergency response framework, the one that had been drafted in 2019, never ratified, never tested, never expected to be needed on a Tuesday in November inside a lecture theater in Mayfair. She went back downstairs. The room had used the 11 minutes of her absence to organize itself into 3 distinct camps: those who believed Sorokin, those who were performing disbelief while quietly verifying, and those who had decided that the most important thing was to be seen responding correctly to a potential destabilization tactic. Hendricks was firmly in the third group. He had moved from his seat to a position near William's end of the table, and he was speaking in the low, composed tones of someone who had been in difficult rooms before and knew how to make them smaller. Sorokin was sitting alone. Petrov had moved 2 seats away from him with the expression of a man reviewing his career choices. Osai walked to William's position and leaned down and said, very quietly, "It's real. We have ESA confirmation. We have approximately 6 hours." William looked at her for a moment. His expression did not change in the way she expected expressions to change when receiving information of this magnitude. It changed in a smaller way, something behind the eyes, a recalculation happening very fast and very quietly. "All right," he said. Then he stood up. "I need everyone's attention," he said, and the room gave it to him the way rooms give attention to people who have earned it rather than demanded it. "Dr. Ose has just returned from our technical team with a verification assessment of Mr. Sorokin's data. I'm going to ask her to summarize it. After that, we are going to change what we're doing today. Because what we plan to do today is no longer the most important thing we can do today." He paused. "Mr. Hendricks, I understand your concerns about process. I share them. I also think that in 6 hours they will seem less important than they do right now." Hendricks said nothing. Osai summarized the technical assessment in 4 sentences. She watched the room absorb it. She watched the performing disbelief camp do rapid internal recalculations. She watched the youngest CEO take his phone from his pocket, look at it, and put it back without making a call, which she interpreted as the decision to be in the room rather than on the phone to his operations team, which was either very brave or very calculated, and she did not have time to determine which. Then William did the thing that she would describe 8 months later as the moment the day changed. He picked up his chair. Not metaphorically. He physically stood, lifted the chair by its back, carried it the length of the table, and set it down next to Victor Sorokin. He sat down. He put his forearms on the table and looked at the old engineer with the complete and undivided attention of someone who had nowhere else to be. "Start from the beginning," he said. "I'm listening." Osai's pen stopped moving. She became aware, after a moment, that the room had gone very quiet, and that the quality of the quiet was different from any quiet she had managed in 14 years of international framework negotiations. It was not the quiet of suspension or of diplomatic paralysis. It was the quiet of people watching something they did not have a category for and choosing, collectively, to wait for the category to form. Sorokin looked at William for a long moment. Something in the old engineer's face shifted, not softened exactly, but settled, the way a structure settles when the load it has been carrying is finally, properly distributed. He opened his notebook. He started from the beginning. The next 4 hours did not have a name in any protocol Osa had ever read. It was not a summit session. It was not an emergency response meeting. It was not a bilateral technical consultation or a multilateral crisis framework activation. It was all of these things simultaneously, running in parallel in a Victorian lecture theatre in London, with a prince at one end of the table who had no formal authority over any of the 23 delegations present, and who was somehow, through some quality she could not fully classify, the reason no one left. She ran communications. She coordinated between the technical team on the 2nd floor and the delegation leads on the 1st. She fielded 4 calls from the Palace Communications Office, 2 from the European Space Agency's Director General, 1 from a number she did not recognize that turned out to be a senior NASA official who had heard about the cascade verification through channels that moved faster than the room's own information sharing, and wanted to know if it was true. "Yes," she said. "How long have you had confirmation?" She looked at her watch. 40 minutes. A pause, "And you're already working on it," she said, and ended the call. William chaired the technical session with Sorokin in a way that served, primarily, as translation, not of language but of register. Sorokin spoke in the compressed, technical shorthand of a man who had spent 50 years inside a specialist discipline. William asked questions that were not technical but were precise. What does that mean for the people in this room? What does that mean for the decision we need to make in the next hour? What do you need from us to slow this down? The questions gave the technical content shape. They gave the delegation lead something to hold. Hendricks came back to the table at the 90-minute mark. He did not acknowledge that he had left. He asked one question about the verification methodology, received a direct answer from the ESA technical lead who had come downstairs by then, and picked up his pen. The framework that emerged was not the framework the summit had been convened to produce. It was smaller and larger simultaneously. simultaneously, smaller in scope, focused entirely on the immediate cascade response, larger in implication because it required every party in the room to commit to a coordinated action on a timeline of hours rather than the months that international agreements usually required. It was written on a whiteboard because, at the 3-hour mark, the secure document system had developed an authentication error that no one had time to diagnose, and everyone had decided, by silent consensus, to simply ignore. Osai stood at the whiteboard with a marker and wrote what the room agreed to as the room agreed to it. She had done this once before, in a fisheries dispute in 2019, and it had produced a document that was later described by a legal scholar as not strictly binding but morally inescapable, which she had come to believe was the highest compliment an improvised international agreement could receive. At the 3-hour 40-minute mark, the framework was complete. It required immediate coordinated maneuver commands for 17 satellites in or near the Cascade Zone. It required a joint monitoring protocol using the Burevestnik array data alongside Western tracking systems. It required a 60-day review process for all decommissioning events in the affected orbital band, with mandatory reporting to a newly designated Joint Technical Committee. It required each delegation to authorize their respective space agency operators to act on the maneuver commands within the hour. Hendricks signed first. He uncapped his pen, signed, and slid it across the table without ceremony. Carlson signed. The Chinese delegation lead signed after a brief, quiet exchange with his colleagues that lasted less than a minute. The pen moved around the table. It reached the Russian delegation's position. Petrov signed. He passed the pen to Sorokin, who had not been asked to sign, who was not formally a delegation lead, who had no official authority to put his name on an international framework document. The room held. Sorokin looked at the pen. He looked at William. William nodded once, a small, unhurried nod, the kind that says, "Yes, this is right, be the thing." Sorokin signed. Os looked at the whiteboard signature sheet and thought about the Burevestnik array, sitting silent and listening for 30 years in 3 locations that appeared on no current map, collecting data that no one knew to ask for, tended by an old engineer who had kept faith with something that the rest of the world had agreed to forget. She did not write this thought down. She kept working. The debrief began at 11:40. That night in a small conference room on the 2nd floor that smelled of cold coffee, and the particular staleness of a room that has been occupied by anxious people for 16 consecutive hours. Osai sat across from Akafa and 2 UK space agency directors who had arrived at 7 in the evening and had been in the building since. The cascade management was underway. 14 of the 17 required satellite maneuvers had been executed successfully. The remaining 3 were in progress, complicated by a communication lag with one operator whose ground station was in a time zone that had not anticipated being relevant to this particular emergency. The cascade had not been stopped. That was important to say clearly, and Osai said it clearly. The fragmentation chain in Sector 7 was ongoing. What the afternoon's framework had achieved was intervention, a coordinated, multi-party response that had slowed the progression and reduced the probability of the self-sustaining threshold being reached from near certain to, currently, approximately 30%. 30% was not good. 30% was, however, 30% instead of 90, and 90 had been the number on the screen at 2 in the afternoon. The Burevestnik data, one of the directors said. How long was that gap in our monitoring coverage? 30 years, Osai said. The room was quiet. Sorokin reported through internal channels 3 weeks ago, she continued. He was told the analysis was inconclusive and given a 4-month review timeline. He attended this summit because someone in the Russian Foreign Ministry decided that this room on this day was the correct place for this information to surface. We don't know yet whether that decision was made because the Foreign Ministry believed the threat or because they believed putting Sarkin in this room would serve some other purpose. She paused. It doesn't matter in the end. He was here. He told the truth. The room nearly decided not to hear it. Akafar, who had been in the communications room for most of the day and had therefore missed the whiteboard moment, asked, "What changed? In the room? What turned it?" Osai thought about the chair, the specific physical, unremarkable act of a man picking up a chair and carrying it to the wrong end of a table. "He listened," she said. "When every protocol said to remove the problem, he sat down next to it." One of the directors asked about future monitoring protocols. The other asked about the legal status of the whiteboard document, which was a genuinely complicated question that would occupy a team of international lawyers for the better part of the next 3 months. Os answered both questions and made notes and scheduled the follow-up sessions, and did all the things that her job required. At some point around midnight, Finch, the young palace liaison, who had graduated from parking concerns to genuine crisis management over the course of the afternoon, knocked and entered with a message. "From Mr. Sarkin," he said, looking slightly uncertain about whether he was handling this correctly. "Through the Russian delegation's liaison, he's asking whether it would be appropriate to send a written communication to His Royal Highness." I looked at the message slip, then she looked at Finch. "What kind of written communication?" "He says," Finch checked his notes, "he says he has been trying to report this data for 3 weeks, and in that time he spoke to 11 people, none of whom listened, and he wants to thank the one person who did." Finch paused. "He also says, and I'm quoting here, that he did not expect it to be a prince." Osai was quiet for a moment. "Tell the palace communications team yes," she said. "Appropriate channels, standard correspondence protocol." She handed the message slip back. And Finch, "Yes, ma'am. You did good work today." Finch looked briefly surprised, then composed himself. "Thank you, ma'am. I've updated the parking arrangements for tomorrow's follow-up session." She almost smiled. "Good," she said. She went back to the lecture theater at midnight. She did this sometimes after long events, when the room was empty and the chairs were back in their rows, and the day's working materials had been cleared away. She stood at the front and looked at the seats and tried to feel what the room had been. The whiteboard was still there. Someone had photographed it 7 times from 7 angles for the official record, but had not erased it yet. The signatures were still visible under the framework text, the careful signatures of people who had come here to negotiate a document over 2 days, and had instead written one on a whiteboard in 4 hours, because the alternative was watching something irreplaceable break. She thought about what her job was. Not managing summits, though she managed them. Not protecting institutional dignity, though she protected it when it was worth protecting and knew when it wasn't. Not ensuring that the right people spoke in the right order in the right rooms, though she spent most of her working hours doing exactly that. Her job, she had decided somewhere in the 3rd hour of the afternoon, was knowing when the room's agreement was the most dangerous thing. Knowing when the consensus, the careful, hard one, diplomatically managed consensus that she had spent 14 years learning to build, was pointing in the wrong direction. Knowing when the person everyone had agreed to ignore was the only person telling the truth. She had not known it in time today. She had been 11 minutes behind. 11 minutes of running a verification that should have been her first instinct instead of her reluctant protocol breach. She would be faster next time. She turned off the lights in the lecture theater, where Faraday had once demonstrated that invisible forces could move physical objects if you understood the field they moved through, and went to write her report. Outside on Albemarle Street, London was doing what London did, moving, indifferent, continuous, underneath a sky that contained, invisibly, 30 million pieces of debris moving at 7 kilometers per second, and 17 satellites that had been steered today by people in a room who had almost decided not to listen, a few degrees away from the path of the thing that would have ended them. 30%. She wrote that number at the top of the first page. Then she started from the beginning.